Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha TV's special program Agenda 2014. I am Krishnanand Tripathi. In this special program, we are going to discuss the issue of a common goods and services tax or the GST. After the election, one of the toughest tasks for the new government will be to implement GST. The GST is expected to completely change the way business is done in India. Given its benefits, let's take a look at the factors that stalled this crucial tax reform.
Goods of all kinds on their way to shops, showrooms and godowns before they end up with the consumer. These trucks are waiting their turn to pay octroi, just one of the taxes paid for these goods. There could also be an entry tax, a central sales tax, a state sales tax, a turnover tax, a consumption tax, and even one for transporting them. All these levies at multiple levels are part of India's indirect tax regime, commonly seen as cumbersome and unfair to both producers and consumers, and downright detrimental to trade, which is why for over 15 years the main political parties have been promising a single goods and services tax in their manifestos. But between the promise and the action lies huge political controversy.
When a consensus on GST was nearly reached, it was the governments of Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat that stalled further progress. Issues that had been settled were reopened. The consensus reached on the draft of the Constitution Amendment Bill was broken and work on the GST bill was interrupted.
Chidambaram wasn't the first UPA minister who blamed Narendra Modi for blocking an affirmative tax reform, although the BJP strongly denies the charge.
If Gujarat was the only government that was not cooperating, what about the other state governments? Were they all cooperating? Was the bill held up only because of Gujarat's non-cooperation?
With a population of 125 crore and a sizable chunk of spenders, today India's market is the world's envy. Recently, we even replaced Japan as the third largest economy in terms of relative purchasing power. But despite all the buying potential, India is a difficult place to do business, thanks to those multiple taxes charged by the centre, states and even local bodies.
India is one country. But unfortunately, it's not one market. There are taxation barriers and different tax territories.
There are physical barriers to the movement of goods across the states. Those barriers will be reduced because the taxes which are being paid at the time of movement of goods from one state to the other, they are proposed to be subsumed into the GST. So these barriers will therefore not be there.
Post-independence, taxes on products and services were clearly demarcated between the centre and the states. The Constitution allowed the centre to tax incomes of individuals and companies and services. The GST bill is giving the right to tax services to the states as well.
It's in the indirect tax arena that you have had various tax jurisdictions, including local tax jurisdiction being run by municipalities and city governments or even local authorities, and the state tax jurisdiction for the various states, and you have the central tax jurisdiction.
The Common Goods and Services Tax was first mooted in 2000. The basic idea was to make tax collection simpler, which is why the NDA government under Atal Bihari Vajpayee decided to merge all indirect taxes into one common tax.
The party initially started thinking on the GST because we felt that there should be a common tax regime, and all of the trade and commerce in the country should be controlled by a common regime.
Experts felt it would be the biggest tax reform since independence, since it would fundamentally change the way business is done in India.
It will bring down the incidence of indirect taxes by well over 20%. No other reform has given you this kind of, no amounts of subsidies can bring this. Roughly the incidence will come down from 36% to about 24%.
At every stage of the transaction, the value addition is what will be taxed. So, the value addition, whatever is the duty paid on that value addition, that duty will be taken as input tax credit for the next stage of the transaction.
Vajpayee appointed West Bengal Finance Minister Ashim Das Gupta as the head of the Empowered Committee of State Finance Ministers. After him, the UPA government appointed Sushil Kumar Modi, the Finance Minister of the NDA government in Bihar, to build consensus.
What the centre did was that they set up this committee that was actually chaired by, that time, Mr. Sushil Modi, of state finance ministers, so that all the states' point of view could be put together.
The UPA government should have decided to bite the bullet, and the BJP was always ready for it. But yes, there were some problems. Every state government raised some problems, and BJP ruled governments also had some problems, like loss of revenue, like proper compensation mechanism.
The goods and services tax will subsume the central excise duty, the additional excise duties, the excise duty levied under Medicinal and Toiletries Preparation Act, service tax, additional customs duty also known as countervailing duty or CVD, special additional duty of customs levied at 4%, and various central surcharges and cesses.
Raising rates doesn't actually lead to revenue increase. If the concern is revenue, you should look at the tax system most likely to generate revenue. And the tax system most likely to generate revenue is a tax system with a very broad base and a very low rate.
At the state level, the GST will absorb sales tax or the value-added tax, entertainment tax except those levied by local bodies, luxury tax, taxes on lottery, betting and gambling, and also state cesses and surcharges. The entertainment tax and the removal of octroi, however, is the subject of dispute between the centre and the states.
The only state which really has octroi as a major issue is Maharashtra, where the cities of Bombay, Pune, Nasik Thane have octrois. Now, the municipal systems, for instance in Bombay, which runs all the hospitals, colleges, etc., are funded by these octrois. They'll have to find solutions to this because we are one of the few left places in the world which have octrois.
The Constitution doesn't provide concurrent taxing powers to the Union and states. The GST, on the other hand, proposes a common tax and confers taxation powers on Parliament and state assemblies.
Because of the huge increase in the base, the rates will be on average lower, and also they'll be uniform instead of these multiple tax rates. It is a major problem. It not only creates complications, it creates genuine uncertainty, and it also creates evasion.
The GST will also remove the cascading effect of taxes by replacing the indirect taxes levied by the centre and states. It will also provide a common national market for goods and services.
We'll have a big base, we'll have much broader base, common base for centre and states, so the collection machinery, etc., will be mutually supportive. Average rate can be lowered and differences across commodities can be eliminated.
Despite all the seemingly obvious benefits of the GST, not all states agreed to come on board. So in 2009, the Empowered Committee of Finance Ministers tried to build consensus with a discussion paper. It proposed a dual GST model with a central GST and a state GST. The proceeds of the central GST were to be shared by the centre and the states on the basis of a devolution formula recommended by the Finance Commission.
Now, from the state's point of view, they're going to gain a much wider base of taxation because they can't tax services at the moment and they will be able to tax services. That's a huge gain in base. Along with the gain of base will be a reduction in rate so that the revenue will remain the same.
After consulting the state governments and other stakeholders, the centre introduced the constitutional 115th Amendment Bill in the Lok Sabha in 2011. It allows both the centre and the states to frame laws. The centre was to have the exclusive power to levy GST on imports and interstate trade. The bill proposed a GST Council of State Finance Ministers, the Union Finance Minister and the Union Minister of State for Revenue. Also proposed was a dispute settlement authority. Only the Supreme Court could consider appeals against its decision.
Now it is time for us to slip into a small break. After the break, we will discuss the concerns of the state governments about the GST. Welcome back. The biggest hurdle in implementing the GST is to convince the states that its implementation will not impact their fiscal autonomy and their revenues.
Opposition-ruled states protested against the draft bill.
Many state governments are of the opinion that the compensation and redressal mechanism there is no mechanism in the first place, and then even if it is there, whatever is in the draft bill is too complicated. So what is required is we have to go into this compensation mechanism again, and which is a very genuine demand.
This fiscal council where both the centre and the states will be represented. I think many states felt that they were concerned whether the centre's power within the council was too high.
The bill exempts certain commodities including petroleum products like diesel, petrol, aviation, turbine fuel and natural gas. District councils and regional councils are empowered to levy tax on entertainment and amusement. They can also tax outdoor advertisements. Municipalities and panchayats are allowed to levy and collect tax on entry of goods for consumption, use or sale in their jurisdiction.
Two sore thumbs have always been the tax on petroleum products, then tax on alcohol and tobacco. Now, tobacco and alcohol are what are called non-merit products, which are not, maybe you could even agree for a phased introduction over time. But petroleum affects the inflation and the economy. So it is necessary that we have a uniform system of taxes on petroleum products.
However, the reform needs a constitutional amendment that has to be approved by legislatures of over 50% of the states. Needless to say, forging consensus isn't easy.
Since the promulgation of the Constitution itself, you've had a deterioration in the state's power of taxation, which perhaps wasn't conceived by the original framers of the Constitution. So what has happened in that background, when you are getting into such a huge tax reforms, naturally there has been a tendency to guard your turf.
Under the Constitution, the Union list is the exclusive domain of Parliament. The state list falls within the purview of the state legislatures, and the concurrent list is where both the centre and the states have the power to make laws. But Parliament is supreme if there are inconsistencies in the Union or the concurrent lists. The GST bill tries to change this by giving tax levy rights to both the centre and the states and taking away the supremacy of Parliament. A look at the entire process of bringing in a constitutional amendment itself shows why it's so difficult to push through such a mammoth economic reform. Article 368 gives the method to amend the Constitution. First, the government introduces the bill in either House of Parliament. This bill then has to be supported by 2/3 members present in each House. But if there's a need to amend any of the three lists, like the Union, State or concurrent lists mentioned in the 7th schedule, the bill has to be ratified by not less than half of the state assemblies.
It is a centre-state relationship and it has to be not on the basis of give and take or bargain, but it has to be on the basis of sincere understanding of the issue and resolving the issue to the best advantage of the nation's economy.
The GST proposal also rakes up an old tussle, one between producing states and consuming states. States like Gujarat, Maharashtra and some southern states are manufacturing hubs thanks to their large industrial base. North Indian states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Odisha and West Bengal on the other hand are predominantly consumers. Since the GST proposes taxation on a destination principle, producing states are opposing it, since they fear that they will be made to wait for the money due to them from taxes collected in consuming states.
A lot of confusion initially was there because this is a tax based at the consumption point. Unlike excise, where the collection is done at the factory gate, and sales tax, which is the state's revenue, which is collected on every sale. This perception that you shall only collect GST, central and state, at the point of sale, people thought that they would lose. It was actually more the industrial states who would lose, because instead of collecting the money upfront, they will have to wait for the transaction transfer from point of consumption. But states like Madhya Pradesh and others always felt the revenues would go down.
GST was also opposed by special category states. These are 11 states that are given excise duty concessions to boost manufacturing. Experts, however, favor doing away with these concessions.
In my view, extending regional excise duty concessions is not actually a particularly good way of promoting development. For most of these states, the real problem for these states is poor connectivity, lack of infrastructure, bad logistics that makes it difficult for people to bring goods and services to the states, and those problems can only be handled by a major thrust on infrastructure development.
An idea that is supported by the principal opposition party as well.
Therefore, we will have to relook this policy of tax holiday, subsidy and all these things, so that economy is run not on the basis of tax holiday and subsidy, but on production and your contribution to the economy.
However, the biggest problem still lies in convincing the states about their fear of revenue loss.
The state's apprehension is that the smaller tax payers or dealers, how would they respond to a dual administration which will be by the center and the states?
This requires a lot of convincing by the central government to the state governments, and there has to be a sense of conviction. When you are going to talk to a state, the state government should have conviction in what you are saying. That unfortunately was lacking during the UPA government, and I hope the next government will have the conviction to convince these states that no such regime will be imposed on them.
Some experts feel the GST will increase tax collections, as was the case with that, and the fears of states are unfounded.
It's just a misperception that revenues will go down. Actually, that was the same thing that happened when VAT was introduced, if you remember. They were all worried that VAT revenues will go down. That is one of the reasons initially a lot of differential rates were used. But slowly over time, states realized that the revenues go up when you administer VATs. Now, even like that, this will be like a second bonanza in revenues.
The states and the center, we would be having a similar forms, formats, procedures. So, when you have a similarity, right now it is so disparate. Forms, procedures are so different. Cost of compliance between states and center are too many. So, when you have similarity, there will be lesser cost of compliance, there will be greater transparency, and for obviously therefore for the tax administrator also there will be benefit.
Experts warn that any compensation for lost revenue can only be for a certain period.
My feeling is it can't be a permanent phenomenon, because every year you cannot be calculating what the revenue would have been in the old system. Because while some revenue is no longer accruing, the gain in efficiency of the system as a whole is generating a whole lot of revenue. So it has to be a deal for 2 or 3 years, a certain amount, and states must have the foresight to accept. And the center should have the foresight also to little bit bend over backward and reassure them.
There's also a widespread agreement that an all-India indirect tax is necessary to control tax evasion.
If you look at it, the communities who will only oppose this would be the traders to some extent, and some of the units which do concealed turnovers. It's not uncommon in India that traders and some businessmen, perhaps more in the SSI sector than elsewhere, maintain 3 sets of accounts. One for the income tax department, one for the state commercial taxes department, and a third one for the central excise. At times the figures in all 3 don't tally.
Departmental officers will be able to focus their energies on the compliance verification and ascertaining and determining whether the tax actually paid was correct or not, and also into audit the anti-evasion part and other parts, that is the back end, the correctness and other things, that the focus will be much more.
Despite the politics over this important economic reform, there's a broad consensus that a common goods and service tax can be a reality in the next 2 to 3 years.
Basically, all states will be looking at neutrality in revenues, and I think that will be assured. Government of India will have to set up a mechanism for subsidizing loss in revenues, if any. Now, how you get that surplus is an issue that will be debated over time. But I don't think that's an insurmountable issue. It's a question of timing. It has been a slow process because lots of concerns have had to be addressed. It's been slow in getting the picture. My own feeling is in the next 2 or 3 years it will come through.
Even the main opposition party BJP feels a fixed timetable is required to implement the GST.
There has to be a dialogue between the center and the state, and we must fix a particular date, time for the implementation of the scheme, and as we go ahead, as the scheme is implemented, there could be problems which could be treated.
It is a political grand bargain as much as it is an economic grand bargain. So there have to be compelling political reasons to arrive at a grand bargain, as you would only compelling economic reasons won't do. So you've had these governments coming and going and not succeeding in actually introducing GST, and several deadlines missed, precisely because that political grand bargain has not yet been achieved.
Parties look at each other in a competitive way, in an adversarial way. Now we are in the middle of a general election, so the most important thing is look forward. Okay, whatever the outcome of the general election, I'm not aware that any major party has taken an anti-GST view. On the contrary, I think they're both the major national parties have said that GST is a good thing. So I think it should be the responsibility of whoever wins to just get it done. It'll be a huge gain to the country, no question.
The idea to turn India into a single common market by having a common goods and services tax has so far failed to take off. Despite its obvious benefits and broad consensus, its implementation appears to be very difficult with no practical deadline in sight. Thanks for watching this special program. For Rajya Sabha Television, I am Krishnanand Tripathi.